Good evening and welcome to John Brown University. We are glad you came for our second Reimagining Faith and Public Life event, co-sponsored by the JBU Political Science Department and the Honors Scholars Program. It is our hope that during this evening you will be both inspired and challenged by our speakers to think critically about the relationship between your faith and your engagement with the important issues of our day. My name is Tricia Posey. I am the Honors Director here at John Brown University, and I will be guiding our discussion with our guests today. Before we begin, I have a number of people I'd like to thank for their help with this event. First, Dr. Daniel Bennett, Assistant Professor of Political Science here at JBU, deserves much of the credit for this evening's discussion and the events surrounding it. This is the second year I've partnered with Dan on Reimagining Faith and Public Life, which is really his brainchild. Dan's creativity, generosity of time and spirit, and commitment to challenging all of us to think critically about faith and politics are gifts to our community. Rebecca Kelly, the administrative assistant for honors, managed many of the details for us, and we're grateful for her hard work to make this event excellent. We received generous financial support from the JBU Office of Academic Affairs, as well as the President's Office, along with the Division of Humanities and Social Sciences, the Office of Teaching, Learning, and Scholarship, and the Office of Christian Formation. Finally, we are grateful to the American Enterprise Institute's Values and Capitalism program, which supplied both funding and books for this event. The video of this evening's discussion will be posted on the Values and Capitalism website, which we encourage all of you to visit. Also, I'd like to let you know that copies of both Dr. Fia's and Dr. Lehmann's books are available for purchase in the JBU bookstore. The bookstore is not open this evening, but you can feel free to visit them tomorrow to purchase a copy of either or both books. And now to our discussion. I'd like to provide a framework for this evening's event before we begin. I'll introduce each speaker before they come up, then each of them will speak for about 15 minutes from prepared remarks. This will be followed by a half-hour conversation in which I'll ask our speakers a few questions, and then we'll open up the floor for questions. There's a microphone in the center aisle, and during the question and answer time, you can come up to the mic and ask a question. I'll let you know when we're getting closer to this part of the event so that you can be prepared. And we do ask that you keep your questions brief so that others might have a chance to engage with our speakers as well. Now to our first speaker. John Fia is professor and chair of the history department at Messiah College in Mechanicsburg, Pennsylvania. His specialty is early American history, and he has also published widely on history pedagogy and the relationship between faith and historical inquiry. John's work has appeared in The Atlantic, Christianity Today, and USA Today, and John is also an active blogger. His blog, The Way of Improvement Leads Home, has 5,000 daily followers, many of whom I'm sure are here today. John's most recent book, Believe Me, The Evangelical Road to Donald Trump, has become a crucial text for understanding the relationship between the American Evangelical Church and the nation's 45th president. Let's welcome John as I invite him up to the podium to speak.
Good evening, everyone. Can you hear me okay? Again, thanks so much to Dan and Tricia and John Brown University for bringing me and Jonathan here to have a conversation about faith and politics in American life, right? The two things that you're never supposed to discuss among polite company, right? We're here to spend an evening discussing. As Tricia mentioned, I am someone who has been doing some writing lately on the relationship between American evangelicals and Donald Trump. I'll start with just a quick story, and maybe some of you can put yourselves in the same situation that I was on the evening of November 8th, as I gathered in my easy chair with my daughters, actually one daughter, one's in college, and my wife and my daughter, and we watched election returns. As an American historian, I honestly thought if the polls and the pundits were going to be right, that we would be making history this night in America. We would have our first female president. Of course, things changed very quickly as the night moved on, and we did make history, although a different kind of history. We had our first reality television star, a person with no political experience whatsoever, who broke down the so-called Hillary firewalls in Wisconsin and Michigan, even my home state of Pennsylvania, and became the 45th president of the United States. That evening, I'm active on Twitter, and I was following along the kind of Twitter feeds. I had been writing a lot in various news outlets and opinion journals, and as well as my own blog. I had been following the sort of way evangelicals had been flocking to Donald Trump, especially in light of the oppositional candidate in Hillary Clinton. I've been following this for a long time, so I had been watching to see what many of the so-called, and I'm saying so-called because this is what the press describes them as, evangelical leaders were saying on Twitter. And as I read through these Twitter feeds and some of the prominent people who I know were supportive of Trump, there was this great victory lap that was being taken, the sense of triumph. And much of that sense of triumph was deeply rooted in sort of providential language, the idea that somehow, praise God, Christians rose up and chose the right man. Evangelicals are once again a force in political life and so forth. And I'll be honest with you, it bothered me a great deal, even to the point of anger, betrayal. Later on, I learned that if the statistic is correct, 81% of white evangelical voters had supported Donald Trump. That night, I was in a place where I didn't want to be, I'm not proud of where I was at the time, but I whipped off a tweet myself. Never tweet when you are emotionally disturbed. And I wrote, the tweet said, I basically wrote this. I think it was in response to the Family Research Council leader, Tony Perkins. I retweeted his tweet. He was taking a victory lap, and I said something to the effect of, if this is American evangelicalism, I'm out. Now, the next day in The Atlantic, the religion writer Jonathan Merritt had a story on how evangelicals responded to Donald Trump, and he included many of these tweets I had been reading, but he put mine in the article. Next thing you know, my email starts lighting up, right? Or my inbox starts filling up. And my evangelical friends were saying, whether they supported Trump or not in the election, were saying, don't leave evangelicalism. Evangelicals, it's the good news of the gospel. You can't leave. And, the more I thought about it, how do you leave evangelicalism, right? Where do you send the letter of resignation? I still don't get how you leave. And then all my secular progressive friends, right, were saying, it's about time, right? We've been waiting for you to see the light and leave the evangelical movement. Again, however we define that. Eventually, a cooler head prevailed. I took off my kind of sense of betrayal as an evangelical. I put on my hat as an American historian. I've been teaching American history for over 20 years, 17 of them at Messiah College. And the more I began to think about this historically, I began to conclude that on one level, evangelical support for Donald Trump was something that was very new and unique, that evangelicals would throw their support behind a man with obvious moral problems, morality, of course, defined by the way evangelicals think about morality. But on the other hand, I saw continuities. In some ways, I kicked myself because I should not have been surprised by some of the ways in which evangelicals responded to the Donald Trump presidency. Because in many ways, evangelicals have had a long history of engaging politics in a way that would have easily led them to choose Donald Trump over Hillary Clinton in 2016. So in the few minutes here I have left, I began to try to think, what were the historical forces at work that led 81% of white evangelicals to support Donald Trump. I really was interested in this as an American historian, right? What was the trajectory here? Why should I have seen this coming? And at first I got caught up in the particulars, right? The Supreme Court, or abortion, or religious liberty issues, or, they hated Hillary, or, some other particular category. But in the end, I found that, or even people on the left, right, who were saying it was about race, or it was about patriarchy, or something like that. In the end, though, what I concluded was, and we can unpack this during the discussion, that evangelical Christians turned to Donald Trump in 2016 for kind of three reasons. And the three reasons are things that conservative white evangelicals at least, have privileged over other things. And the argument goes something like this. White evangelicals turn to Donald Trump in such large numbers because they have privileged fear over hope in their politics. They have privileged the pursuit of political power over a politics driven by humility. And they have privileged nostalgia for a golden age that may or may not have ever existed over good history. So I spent most of the book unpacking these three ideas, and then conclude with another model for thinking about evangelical public engagement. And that stems from a trip I took in the summer of 2017 on a bus tour traveling through civil rights sites in the South. We went to 10 days on the road, hitting almost every civil rights place. And there, as I began to study more in depth, remember, as Tricia said, I'm an early American historian, so I'm not a scholar of the civil rights movement. But there I saw a vision of politics that was clearly driven by hope over fear, by humility and self-sacrifice over the pursuit of political power, and by some pretty good uses of history, especially as it relates to the founding of the country and what our founding fathers called us to be, over this kind of nostalgic longing for a golden age. After all, African Americans, as many people I know tell me, that the best time to live as an African American in this country is today, right? Still a long way to go. But so this is at the heart of my book. This is what I unpack. And, by the end of it, I realized I have three H's, right? Hope, what's the second one? Humility and history. And so I often kid that 3 H's, 3 points, alliteration, right? Someone just needs to do the poem and the prayer, and my evangelical identity is confirmed here at John Brown University. So hopefully we can pick up some of these themes in the Q&A.
Thank you, John. And now I'd like to introduce our second speaker, Dr. Jonathan Leeman. Dr. Lehmann is the editorial director for 9 Marks, an organization that equips church leaders with resources for healthy church development. He has a Master of Divinity from Southern Seminary, a PhD in ecclesiology from the University of Wales, and experience in both political science and economics. Dr. Leeman is the author or editor of many books, 13 and counting, as well as numerous articles. In his book, How the Nations Rage, Lehmann challenges Christians to shift our focus from redeeming the nation to living as a redeemed nation. We look forward to hearing from Dr. Lehmann today. Please join me in welcoming him to the podium.
Thank you, friends. You just did that extemporaneously. I got notes here. I'm going to be a little more boring, all right? But let me try to situate myself relative to what Dr. Fia, did I say it right? Fia said. He's speaking as a historian. He's looking at the Trump moment. He's responding as a historian. He's looking at different historical causes and asking questions about them and moving forward. I want to do the same thing, but I'm going to speak. My training is in theology. I'm going to do it as a theologian, right? And I hope a pastor theologian. So let me, in fact, start in that same moment of November 2016. It's the Sunday after the election, in which we are all like, whoa, didn't see that coming. And I'm teaching a Sunday school class on Christians and government through the course of that fall, the material that would eventually become the book. And I just thought, okay, I was supposed to teach on government and family, I think, that Sunday. And I just thought, we can't do that. We have to address what just happened. So I started with like 20 minutes of comments on empathizing with those who hold different positions than you as part of our Christian duty. If you're on the majority side, or if you're candidate one, then you need to empathize with those who lost, and if you lost, and trusting that God is still sovereign, and just trying to find pastoral things to say in that moment, kind of scrambling. And the church, by the way, is 6 blocks behind the U.S. Capitol, so right there on Capitol Hill. And I forget if I told this story in the book or not, honestly. And an older African-American lady right there who I know reasonably well raised her hand. Yes. You talked about empathy. Nobody's empathizing with me. My friends, why do you go to that racist church? I can't believe what's going on. Sister, I'm so sorry. A few minutes later, a middle-aged white woman back there stands up and says, I can't believe what I'm hearing. She was a visitor. I go to Mike Pence's church. He's an evangelical Christian. He's not a demon-crat. And I'm just like, why am I doing this Sunday school class? But there it was. I'm giving you a picture of that division I think many of us felt going through that fall and continue to feel in many ways, both outside the church in culture generally, but also inside the church. And so what I'm trying to do in that book is respond as a theologian and pastor and say, okay, how should we approach politics? How should we as believers think about these things? Right? And there are 3 wrong ways, I think, moving forward. Dr. Fia talked about his 3 things, and he offered the alternatives. Let me give you my 3 wrong ways to think about engagement. Wrong path number 1, I think, is disengagement. The Jonah option. Run to Tarshish. If I had a whiteboard, I'd write down 2 words, love and justice. For the sake of loving your neighbor, you're to pursue justice. Disengagement, the Jonah option, is not an option. Wrong path number 2, capitulation. Go along with the world. An extreme example would be the pastors of the German Evangelical Church, established in 1933, which signed on with the Nazi Party. That'd be an extreme example. I would say a subtler example would be the path of liberal Christianity's accommodating itself to the sexual ethic of the day. This path looks promising. It wins friends. It offers immediate political results, but it's short-sighted. It's a way of saying peace, peace, when there is no peace. I would say Judas took the accommodationist route. I would say Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego didn't. Okay, that's another wrong path. A third wrong path would be worldly engagement. You pursue, let's say, good things, but you do it with a worldly strategy or tone. You make compromises you shouldn't, and you undermine your witness. You give earthly political outcomes, such as a vote on a law, an election, a Supreme Court nomination, an outsized importance. Talking as if this election is the most important thing in the world. And along the way, you tell the world that Christianity is just a branch of this or that party. And quietly hiding underneath the floorboards of this third error is utopianism, a belief that we can bring heaven to earth now. In many ways, I think that's probably what you're responding to, historically speaking. I think that's probably the greatest danger for many Christians today. Okay, what's a better approach? Let me suggest 5 things. Number 1, hit the restart button on how we approach faith and politics. I think Christians in America tend to merge the sacred lines of our nation's history with the political lines of Scripture, and we kind of confuse one with the other. A classic example would be Jesus' words, render to Caesar what is Caesar and to God what is God's, and we think to ourselves, okay, so you have 2 circles. You have Caesar's things, and over here you have a circle, God's things. And inside of this circle, you got of Caesar's things, you got like, politics and culture and so forth, governance. Over here in God's things, you got like religion and the church and salvation and worship. I think that's an American way of thinking. I don't think that's what Jesus was talking about. Look at the text a little bit more closely. What's he saying? Well, clearly, on the one hand, he is saying to a group of Jews who are accustomed to a certain church-state arrangement that no longer abides. They are to give honor to Caesar. He is a fair government. They do not need a Jewish king, right, any longer. Caesar is a king they are to acknowledge. So there is a separation of church and state, I would say, in that text. But what does Jesus also say? He says, bring me a coin. Whose image is on it? Whose inscription? Caesar's. Well, as any Jew standing there would have known, whose image is Caesar in? God's. Rendering to God what is God's includes Caesar. You have a big circle, God's things. And inside of that you have a smaller circle, Caesar's things. And so sure, fast forward a few pages later, Matthew 28, all authority in heaven and earth is given to me. Right? Says Jesus. So step 1 of hitting the restart button means realizing that the separation of church and state, which I'm going to argue, not tonight, but I would argue strenuously for, is not the same thing as the separation of religion and politics. We can discuss that later. But I think that's crucial. Step 2, invest our political hopes firstly in the church. Invest our political hopes firstly in the church. That's a weird thing to say. What do I mean? Well, let me try to give you a taste of what I mean with a friend of mine his name is Charles. He's a speech writer. He writes speeches for people whose names you would know. He is at the center of American politics. Charles is also friends with my friend Freddie, both of them members of my church. Freddie, however, was a member and then was removed from the church because he was stealing from members to support a drug addiction and refused to repent when confronted, ended up homeless. That's when Charles entered the picture and began reading the Bible with Freddie, ushering him along little by little until Freddie got to a point where he repented. And with Charles's help, stood in front of the church, confessed his stealing, confessed his lying, and repented of those things. And the church cheered, and we welcomed Freddie back into the congregation. So here's the question for you, the huge question. Which of the two Charleses is the political Charles, the speechwriter or the disciple maker? Which of those is the political Charles? Well, which Charles deals with welfare policy, housing policy, criminal reform, education? Well, clearly both. In fact, Charles would tell you that the disciple maker fashions and shapes and gives integrity to the speechwriter because it's all under the same king. Right? And it's through relationships like these that we should see that the local church is a model political society where you see true righteousness and true justice beginning to shape and develop and then be lived out and spilled outward. That's the starting point. And so in the American tradition, going back to John Winthrop, referred to the Plymouth colony as a city on a hill, and that's picked up eventually by Kennedy and Reagan, and we refer to the nation as a city on the hill. Well, that's not right. You know from Scripture and what Jesus said who the city on the hill is to be. It's the church. It's not the nation. I think many Christians continue to put their political hopes in the nation, and friends, that's not where we should put our hopes first and foremost politically. It's in the life of the church where we first learn to love our enemies, first trade in our swords for plowshares and spears for pruning hooks. It's with your fellow members, the ones who frustrate you and annoy you and step on your toes, and they don't show up when they said they were going to show up for nursery schedule, and who are different than you, and like, these people are weird. Okay, it's there you first learn to love and pursue righteousness and justice with a people. That's where you learn politics. If you're not doing it there, why would I think you're going to do it out there? Right? And that brings us to a third step. Number 3, we must learn to be before we do. We must learn to be before we do. If our political hope should first rest in churches, we must be before we do. So Paul asked the Jews of his day, you who preach against stealing, do you steal? Let me ask you a few questions of my own. You who call for immigration reform, do you practice hospitality with visitors to your church who are ethnically or nationally different than you? You who speak against abortion, do you also embrace and assist the single mothers in your church? Do you encourage adoption? You who talk about welfare reform, do you give to the needy in your congregation? You who proclaim that all lives matter, do all your friends look just like you? You who share your opinions on social media, do you gladly share the Lord's Supper with church members who disagree? Do you pray for his or her spiritual good? And as was just mentioned, I think we need to shift our focus from redeeming the nation to living as a redeemed nation, and then let any work we do spill out from there. From transforming the culture to living as a transformed culture. Step 4, work for good government, but recognize the public square for what it is. It's a battleground of gods. Well, what is the public square, if you're not familiar with that phrase? Well, it's all those places where the nation goes to talk, debate, make decisions that bind the whole public. It's the letter to the editor, it's the parent-teacher association, it's the hallways of Congress. But more than that, the public square is where a nation goes to wage warfare on behalf of its gods. That's what we're all there doing. Americans like to talk as if we can step into the public square and leave our gods behind. That's impossible. Nobody does that. Not the Christian, not the Muslim, not the Hindu, not the progressivist, not the atheist, not the agnostic. You do not leave your gods. You cannot leave your gods behind when you step into the public square. A while back, I was teaching a number of college students who had come to Washington, D.C. for internships, and I was explaining some of this to them. And one of them said to me, well, so are you saying that we should impose our morality through law? And I said, name one law for me that doesn't impose a morality. And the students stopped and thought and kind of chuckled. That's what law does. It imposes a morality. There's none that doesn't. Okay. Similarly, I think of Senator Dianne Feinstein challenging a Roman Catholic woman who had been nominated for a circuit court judgment. She said to this nominee, your dogma, meaning her Roman Catholic dogma, your dogma lives loudly within you. And that was a concern to Senator Feinstein. And I guess the question I wanted to ask the senator was, do you assume your dogma doesn't live loudly within you? Are your dogmas about God, universe, justice, morality not informing every decision you make when you step into the Senate? Of course they are. I think of Stephen Douglas in 1858 in a debate with Abraham Lincoln saying he was neutral on the matter of slavery. He said he didn't care if it was voted up or down. And Lincoln rightly replied, the only person who could say that is somebody who wasn't neutral on slavery, who thought it was morally permissible. In the same way, I'm saying behind every Senate Judiciary Committee vote, every Supreme Court decision, every protester's picket line, every social media campaign is someone's basic worldview of how things ought to be. And behind that worldview is a God, big G, small g. And this is true whether the matter up for a debate is abortion, same-sex marriage, tax policy, immigration law, funding for national parks. None of us steps into the public square leaving our objects of worship behind. We take them with us. It's impossible to do otherwise. Step 5. As Christians, we need to be less American and more patriotic. Less American, more patriotic. To put it in another way, my pastoral concern is to help you, insofar as you claim to be a Christian. My pastoral concern is to help you identify more with Christ, and so that you might love your fellow citizens more, no matter the name of your nation. Think about what your baptism, if you've been baptized, signifies. You've been buried with Christ and raised with him. You are born again, right? That language, there's the new creation. And that means everything that this world would use to categorize you, to classify you. Let me just use me. I'm Jonathan, son of a Leeman. I'm white, male, college educated, middle class, right? All of these identity categories. Am I not those things anymore? Well, no, I am all of those things. But now, as someone who's been buried and raised with Christ, the most fundamental thing about me is that I am united to him. I'm a Christian. And so now I take all of those things and I take them and I lay them before his throne and say, okay, what would you have me, Jonathan, as you've designed me to do with those things? The son of a Lehmann. What would you have me, the fact that I'm a white, with all the privileges and responsibilities that come with that, Lord Jesus, what would you have me do with my whiteness? The fact that I'm a male, and forget how culture defines or doesn't define male. How do you define male, Lord Jesus? And use my maleness for your glory and for the others' good. The fact that I'm an American and middle class and college, how would you have me, Lord Jesus, use those things for your glory and the good of others? Because the fundamental thing about me is Christian, follower of Christ. Right? And in the same way, Christians in America need to loosen their grip on the fact that we're Americans just long enough to let Jesus define who we are for us. And then use that for the good of others, whether other Americans or those who are not Americans. It frees us both to affirm what is good in America as well as to be critics when we need to be of things that are not good. So friends, if you've been baptized, remember your baptism. Your baptism argues that you've been buried and raised with him, and you should represent his righteousness and justice wherever you go. And in other words, a Christian's political posture is never to go in and dominate. It's not to withdraw. It's to represent. Represent King Jesus. Let me conclude. If you claim to care about politics, but you're not an active member of a local church, I don't think you know what you're talking about. I live in Washington, D.C. I have lots of people come. We have lots of people saying, oh, we're all about politics, but they come there and they're not involved in the church and they claim to be Christians. And it's like, you're not willing to pick up an old lady on the way to the church. I don't know what you mean when you say you follow Jesus, right? Be before you do. You're like somebody who's taking little trucks on the ground making vroom noises when there's a truck right next to you and you can climb in and drive it, right? And so that's why my church cares about welfare policy. So when church member Jane found herself homeless, we tried to place her in safe housing. And due to various mental difficulties, she refused that and she went and slept in a park. And so my friend Luther went down to the park and slept on a bench nearby her. Okay, he cares about welfare policy. That's why we care about tax policy. So Carlos, who spends his working days explaining to U.S. Congress the tax implications of new legislation, has spent many evenings helping a family in crisis with their taxes. My church believes it's important to address America's race problem, or at least our own racial problems. And so when Patty confessed to me one day, because she heard I was coming back in the evening, I was going to give an address on race, she came to me and said, "Jonathan, I'm so glad you're talking about race. I have to admit, I'm really embarrassed. I have a hard time with black people. I know that's wrong. I'm glad you're going to address it." And I said, I'm going to make up a name. "Do you know Joe?" And Joe is a godly African-American man in the congregation. "And his wife?" "Yeah." "Why don't you invite yourself to dinner at Joe's house and tell him what you told me?" She said, "Are you serious?" I said, "I'm not sure. I think so." And I wouldn't do that with just anybody. I know, again, Joe is a godly man. I knew he could handle it. And so she did. And she confessed her sin to them. And they forgave her. And they embraced her. And she grew a little bit in righteousness on that day. We care about America's, or at least our, race problem. And so that's where we begin. So, friends, we got to rethink how we're doing politics. We got to be before we do. We got to invest our hopes in the church. Start there. And then we build out recognizing the public square for what it is. You didn't wear the blue blazer.
I know, I'm not matching.
Are these on? Yeah.
Yep. Thank you both for your really thoughtful comments. We have a few questions for you, and my first question for both of you is, so both of you have books that have come out recently. You just sort of summarized your books for us. So what has been the biggest or most frustrating misunderstanding from those critiquing your book, and how have you come to answer this misunderstanding?
Those of you who've been around John Brown today with me have heard this already, but I think the biggest misunderstanding and probably the biggest flaw in my book is a lack of kind of nuance about white evangelicals and why they voted for Donald Trump. I think that 81%, and even in conversations today, I've learned more about this. I think that 81% number, whether it's the actual number or not, represents a whole set of evangelicals with very, very different reasons for supporting someone like Donald Trump. So you have the lock her up crowd who goes to the rallies and cheers and, those kinds of evangelicals. I don't think they would necessarily be interested in anything my book has to say or willing to, in some ways, listen to my arguments. You have others who I think, though, have legitimate concerns about things like the Supreme Court or things like abortion or things like moral decay in our society. Who thought that, you made a sort of Faustian bargain, or, you're willing to overlook the moral problems with the candidate in order to get these policies done. So sometimes I think I cast the 81% with a very broad brush, and I've been pushed back a lot for that. Yeah.
In some ways similar. What I'm in many ways trying to do in my book is help Christians detach their Christian identity from their party identity. Not to say party identity, or rather things that the parties are pursuing are not worth pursuing. But I'm trying to say firm grip, loose grip. biblical principle, prudential decision. And so I'm trying to create a little bit of space because I feel like we've over-identified party membership with Christianity. And I think some Christians on left and right in different tribes do go both ways. So I'm trying to create some distance there. And the danger of that is, similar to what you were saying, is, oh, so you don't think these matters of justice are important? Well, I think they're profoundly important. I just think the church institutionally, and pastors especially, need to be careful to not confuse God's revealed wisdom with their own wisdom about how to accomplish certain matters of justice. There's a difference between posture of heart and the policy application that you pursue. So yeah, that'd be the pushback and my fear of that people would conclude.
A commonality between your books is that both of you identify fear as a prevalent motivating factor in evangelical political engagement. What do you think are the sources of these fears, and how do you think they influence Christian involvement in the public sphere?
You know,
Well, that gives me time to think, and then I can say something.
This is kind
clever.
of unfair, right? You get all that. You know, I approach this as a historian, and fear has been present, I think, in the evangelical story for a long time. I love the quote from Marilyn Robinson, the Pulitzer Prize-winning novelist, who says that fear is not a Christian habit of mind. I highly recommend her New York Times op-ed piece, or maybe it was New York Times Magazine piece on fear, where she kind of makes that argument. I was telling the class today, I think fear is a product of the fallen nature of the world. We're naturally going to be afraid because of sin, because of the brokenness of the world. But I don't think fear is ever a place where Christians should dwell. Or certainly it is not a kind of emotion or an attitude that one should build a political philosophy around. Because fear often leads to anger. Fear often leads to what Jonathan talked about in his talk, turning to kind of politics, in some cases political strongmen, to protect you from these fears, right? Perfect love casts out fear, right? You know, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I fear no evil. You know, I think there's always been an inherent story of evangelicals responding to social and demographic changes, the dents in what they understand to be their Christian nation, their city on a hill, by responding with a backlash that's often associated with fear, whether it's Catholics coming into the country in the 1850s, right? Let's not pretend that it was white evangelicals who were at the front of the know-nothing nativist movements that tried to keep them out, right? Because they were afraid about what Catholics are going to do to their white Protestant nation. You know, I was telling the class today, when Thomas Jefferson gets elected in 1800, you have all these New England former children of Puritans who are scared that now that Jefferson, an infidel who doesn't believe in the resurrection, has been elected president, he and his henchmen are going to come into their towns, confiscate their Bibles, close their churches, right? And the response is this kind of panic in New England during this point. Not unlike, say, what Ted Cruz says when he says, we're one justice away from erasing crosses from gravestones and so forth, right, if we don't elect the right person. So evangelicals, despite the fact that they have deep theological and biblical resources at their disposal through spiritual disciplines and so forth to overcome fear with hope or some other Christian virtue, have always sort of not only been part of the backlash against social and demographic change, but have often been leading it. So I think the turn to Donald Trump for many, and this is where I go back to the answer to your first question, right? For many is a fear of rapid social change under the Obama administration, or fear of what might happen if Hillary Clinton got elected. I think it's a powerful emotion that often drives evangelical politics, and it's a very unhealthy emotion from a Christian point of view.
Are you saying that evangelicals are more driven by fear than other segments of the population, or are you saying you're just as driven by fear as other segments, and you should know better because you have other resources.
Well, again, I've said this a couple times today in various settings. I don't hold like, my secular friends who are scared to death of Donald Trump, right? Who are fearful of Donald Trump and what he's going to do to America. I don't hold them accountable. I don't expect them to not be afraid, right? I think Christians should be, have a higher standard on this front, because, the idea of fearing not, or perfect love casts out fear, is deeply embedded in who we are as believers who trust in a providential God. And it may sound like a platitude, but a God that works all things out together for good. And will one day return and make all things new, right? So when you have a deep faith in that, it can provide an antidote to this kind of fear.
That's why on my whiteboard I put love and justice. I didn't put love, justice, and fear. I mean, I think you should, hate injustices, and one could use the phrase be afraid of certain injustices happening, but even then your motivating impulse is a love impulse and a desire for justice impulse, not a panic impulse. So why do we struggle with fear? Because we're failing to love, because we don't have faith. I'd also say because we're this worldly minded, right? We're not putting our, there's the common critique of Christians, so heavenly minded, no earthly good. I think it's just the opposite. I think the most heavenly minded person is free to do the most earthly good, because I'm now free to pour myself out for the good of others. And so if you look at, hymnody in the 19th century, 70 out of 200 hymns in a hymnal would be focused on heaven. On Jordan's stormy banks I stand, and, thinking of going into the celestial city. Whereas you look at hymnody today, 10 hymns will be focused on the hope that's stored up for us. That's a dramatic change, and I think Christians need to get better at realizing who they are in the gospel and what we're called to, so that we are free to pour ourselves out, not in fear, but in love for the purposes of justice.
I agree. I think fear. We're also fearful of being persecuted, right, for our faith. This may be a controversial statement, I don't know, but, maybe the Christian church needs a healthy dose of persecution to kind of strengthen it. And, and granted, I think you make a great point in your book, Jonathan, where you say, persecution of the church is not always the Tertullian, the seed of the church. There are examples where persecution kind of wipes the church out in certain areas, but we are so driven by fear that, we're going to lose our rights as Americans to practice our faith and so on. We need to fight for that. I'm not, I think it's wrong. I'm totally on board with sort of the defense of religious liberty, but we also, I think you pointed this out, we must also be prepared to suffer. And that's what we don't like.
Well, it's like, what prosperity gospel have you believed in?
Yeah.
Like, who do you think you're following?
Yeah.
You're following Jesus. What happened to him?
Well, there's a reason why, Joel Osteen and these other figures are so popular, because they're offering a gospel without any kind of sin or suffering and so forth. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you both. So James Davison Hunter talks about this idea of faithful presence, which both of you talk about in your books. And Jonathan, you've talked a little bit about what that looks like in practice in what you've given us this evening. But this idea of faithful presence seems important to both of you. What does faithful presence look like in our political system today?
What's it look like? I mean, I think I would refer back to my, and yeah, sure, and I appreciated that aspect of your book as well, because in many ways I'm saying the same thing. What's it look like? It means Christians joining churches. It means Christians learning to live together in love and righteousness and holiness. It means Christians voting. It means Christians getting to know the issues at hand and voting. It means maybe Christians going into law, legal practice, going into politics in one form or other. But each of us have different callings, so I'm not going to impose my calling on you as such. I live in Washington, D.C. I have resources available to me there, members of my church that you may not. And you might be at home with like 4 little kids. Okay, well, you have a certain calling at that point that's different than maybe your calling right now. Your kids are a little older, you're working here, you have other opportunities available to you, right? So I think calling has to come in to answer the question, what does faithful political presence look like? So it's going to look differently for different ones of us, but I think the commonalities are going to be living with the people around you, showing hospitality. I said to the class today, buy Rosaria Butterfield's book, The Gospel Comes with a House Key. Write that down, buy it, read it this week. The Gospel Comes with a House Key. She is just, her and her husband show remarkable neighborhood hospitality and drawing people in, and that's transformative in wonderful ways. That's what faithful political presence looks like in her life and in her husband's life. Yes, I want Christians to go into politics, public square work. That's probably going to be the minority of people, right? Most of us are not going to run for Congress. Most of you will not be chief of staff for a congressperson. So we could talk about those things. I could say, all right, young cultural warriors, be William Wilberforce. But look, most of you are not going to be. If you can, great, do it. But right, most of us just don't live there. So I think it's in these kinds of things that I've been talking about. Looking for ways to get to know your neighbors, get involved in local politics. Christians are too obsessed, I would say, with national politics. Like, let's pay more attention to state and local politics, because frankly, it's in your city council and in your state house where most of the decisions that affect your life on a daily basis are happening, not in D.C. And I think Christians could get more involved in those places. I'm just babbling at this point, so I'm going to defer to my brother.
Yeah, I don't disagree with anything that you said. I mean, I do think, and I think you get at this in your book when you think about the church as a political, right? We have this idea of politics as we think about it in terms of electoral politics, right? Who we go vote, we go run for office, and so forth. The whole idea of faithful presence, as Hunter lays it out, is to try to promote change, be salt and light, whatever you want to call it, without necessarily relying upon formal electoral politics. So, I highly recommend the book, To Change the World, because Hunter's arguing both the evangelical left and the evangelical right are guilty of trying to change the world through politics. But if you define politics in a much broader way, right, a concern with the polis, right, the communities that we live in, I've been really influenced by a political scientist that many evangelicals don't read. His name is Glenn Tinder. And 2 great books, The Political Meaning of Christianity and The Fabric of Hope. And there he defines politics very simply. Politics requires 2 things. It requires, one, attentiveness to the world. What are the world's greatest needs? What is my neighborhood's greatest needs? What is my family's greatest needs, right? What are the needs that are out there? So you need to be attentive. And this is beyond just like make sure you read the newspaper every day, right? This is kind of knowing your neighbors, knowing what your neighbors need. If you have an African-American neighbor, it might require you to know something about African-American history and the experience that person's went through, right? Be attentive. And then the second is be available then, right? Be attentive. What are the great needs of the world? And then what can I do about it in the sphere where God has placed me, the community where God has placed me? And there, if you think about politics as Tinder talks about it in a much more, generous way than just electoral politics, then it plays right into this idea of being faithfully present where you are, right? Where God has placed you, serving your neighbor. You may be called tomorrow to make a political act by bringing a cup of soup to your sick neighbor, right? In some ways, Tinder would say that is a political act because you're attentive. You've been attentive to what your neighbor's doing. She's sick or he's sick, and then you made yourself available. So I think this is a way of thinking about politics that I think meshes really well with the idea of being faithfully present, and Hunter's kind of take on this, which I've been deeply influenced by as well in the book. Yeah.
I like that word attentive. Can I give an illustration of that, of something I've witnessed? My pastor back in D.C. reads local news. Who reads local news? Reads local news, and then it shows up in his pastoral prayers. And what you'll find is that local news in Washington, D.C. is largely concerned with African American issues. And our church is probably, I want to say, 1/3 minority, 2/3 majority. So a lot of the majority culture members sitting there, hearing the pastor pray things that showed up like, Lord, there's been this raft of girls missing in D.C., 13, 14-year-old girls suspect maybe sex trafficking. It's just been prominent. But white people in D.C. kind of don't know that. They're not being attentive. Meanwhile, their African American neighbors are very aware of this, because in many cases it's their girls, right? And so I feel like my pastor set a good example of reading local news and bringing that before the Lord, praying those things and setting that example for the congregation. So, you might consider your own news sources. You might consider the things that you read. Or again, you might consider what your friends look like, what kind of conversations you have. Is your life and your input all within your own little subcultural enclave? Well, when Jesus commands you to go and make disciples of all nations, he's calling you maybe to move to Madagascar, or maybe he's just calling you to read the local news, or maybe different magazines, or have conversations with people who look different than you, and develop Christian empathy, right? And then learn to love your neighbors yourself. And I think that's a huge step.
I would just add one more thing on the faithful presence, is that we as and again, this is the sort of historian, but since the late 70s and 80s, we have been schooled, especially even white evangelicals of a certain age, have been schooled in a political playbook that says you solve the culture by electing the right people, pursuing political power, winning the Supreme Court, and then if you get the right president in and the right Supreme Court justices, somehow all of our deepest moral problems has the potential of being solved. And I think Jerry Falwell Sr. may be one of the most important political figures of post-World War II America, because he has taught millions and millions and millions of evangelicals that this is the way you bring about cultural change, and this is the way Christians should be witnesses in the public square. And I think Hunter provides a great corrective to that. And there are other models, thoughtful evangelical Christians, who have thought through these questions, whether it be someone like Michael Gerson, who draws heavily from Catholic social teaching, or the Washington University law professor John Inazu, who argues for a confident pluralism, right? There's all these models out there, but the power of that playbook we've imbibed it so deeply that we can't think of any other way of approaching politics than the way we have been taught by the Christian right.
And this event is called Reimagining Faith in Public Life, and so we're very thankful for the tangible examples you just gave us.
And that's the startup, right? Where was your point? To start all over, right?
Restart,
yeah, restart, right? I mean, we need a restart, because the playbook's getting old.
That was my first title for the book that I suggested to the publishers, Political Restart. Yeah. And they're like, yeah.
All right, I'm about to ask my last question. So those of you who have some questions that you want to ask might start thinking about them, jotting them down if you need to. So I'll ask my last question, and then we'll open it up to you all. So the last question, ending on this note of hope. As you think about the future of the church and political engagement, where do you imagine positive leadership will come from?
As we imagine the political leadership of the church? Say that again?
The future of the church and political engagement. Where is positive leadership going to come from?
I don't know.
I am optimistic. I've said this several times today. I'm optimistic about, what are they, Gen Z? Is that right? Yeah, Gen Zers, go Gen Zers. I look at this in my own daughters. I think they are tired of the old playbook. They're ready for a restart. And then I also said this today that the same rhetoric was used in the 1970s. There was this guy named Richard Cubideau who wrote a book called The Young Evangelicals, right? And all of these so-called young evangelicals in the 70s became members of the Christian right and confused America with the church and so forth. But so I've hope in that. And I think in some ways the answer to your question, Tricia, is a demographic one, right? I mean, where is the church flourishing? Where are the revivals happening? In the global South, right? Hispanics. What are the statistics in America? Soon whites will be a minority, right? So people who have been outside of the traditional white Christian America narrative are just demographically going to step up and be leading the next generation of the church. And they've had experiences, outside of power, right? They've had experiences where they're not caught up with this kind of nostalgic longing for a Christian golden age that may have never existed. So if I were to guess, I would say that's where the future of the church is going. And I also would guess that as the church moves in that direction, there's going to be more of a backlash coming from white Christians who are still wed to this idea that we are somehow a white Christian nation. We can expect more of it, even in the wake of Trump.
I certainly can't predict whether things will get better or worse, right? I mean, the Lord has his ways. He's the Lord of history. He raises up, he takes down. There's no telling. The Lord also causes his rain to fall on the righteous and the unrighteous. I think Christians will have useful things to contribute. I think non-Christians will have useful things to contribute because of God's common grace. I'm slightly frustrated when whites talk about things getting worse. Well, maybe in some respects things have gotten worse. But if you're an African American, have things gotten worse since 1950? Since 1850? I'd say in many ways things have gotten better, right, compared to those times. And so the white Christian, things are getting worse, just kind of shows that you're just thinking from your own perspective, right? I think history is complicated. I think some things get better, some things get worse. It moves simultaneously. I think, again, a Christian's hope cannot be in this world. We seek to do good. We seek to bring dominion and life and flourishing to whatever little plot of the garden the Lord gives us to manage while we're here and try to leave it better than when we got here. Yes, for the sake of justice and for the sake of loving our neighbors and ourselves. Nonetheless, we're called to do that, and we're called to represent King Jesus, whether the world's against us or the world's with us at this particular moment. It kind of doesn't matter. I think the fear, the panic, is the wrong impulse, whether skies are cloudy or clear. We can move in, I would say, with a cheerful confidence that Jesus wins. If you're a Christian, you believe that. Jesus wins, right? And in the meantime, we have lots of good we get to do, partly in sharing his gospel and also in doing good to our neighbors, right? So that's where I want Christians to put their focus. Not in anticipating things getting a lot better or a lot worse. It's that panic which leads to the sort of stuff that you've been describing.
Well, hope inherently within hope is this idea. And I'm not talking here about a kind of just, Barack Obama type optimism, right? The sort of right and wrong. We got to be on the right side of history. But hope is a theological, right, and an eschatological idea. It's an idea that one day there will be a new heavens and a new earth, and the kingdom of God that will be defined by these things, right? Justice, compassion, love, and the now and not yet, right? We are back to the politics question, right? We are citizens of a kingdom. And we act politically as members of that kingdom, and the rules in which that kingdom is based on is how we should be living out. I love N.T. Wright on this in Surprised by Hope, where he argues that inherently hope is this idea that one day the trajectory of human history is on our side, right? It's moving towards Christ wins, right? And as a Christian and a historian who lives in a world in which the direction of history is largely kind of a progressive movement towards a kind of utopian society in which one day we will ultimately cheat death, right? The modern project of the Enlightenment. I think what defines any Christian historian is that it's a very different narrative of the direction in which history is going that kind of goes against the modern way of thinking about this. Yeah, I agree.
Thank you so much. Now I'm going to turn it over to our audience for questions. Please make your way to the mic if you have a question. And remember, again, to keep it brief because there might be others who have questions as well.
I'll ask a question. Should I come to the mic?
Yes, please.
This question is for Dr. Fay. I haven't heard you talk.
Right up to the mic.
Oh, yes. In discussing the election of Donald Trump, I once wondered how Nazi Germany allowed Hitler to become their ruler. I now know. Can you comment upon the election of Donald Trump and Nazi Germany, a comparison? Do you think we're there?
Someone asked me this. This came up earlier today at another venue, and no is the short answer. I'm very skeptical of kind of taking other eras and comparing them with present day eras. Nazi Germany was very, very different than 2016 United States of America. Can we find certain traits that represent, that were present in fascism in the 1930s that perhaps might be associated with the way Donald Trump does certain things, or the populism and the appeal to fear that he makes? Yes, certainly you can draw some continuities and comparisons there. I've hesitated to use the F word, right? To talk about this. So I just, and as a historian, I just feel uncomfortable kind of saying, well, this is where we are today. We're in the same place we were with Hitler. So to me, that's a great historical sin to kind of put too much emphasis on, well, Donald Trump is the new X or the new Y, or everything is happening the same way and we're going to go down this same path now.
It's a way to get debate points. It's a way to throw meat to your audience.
Yeah.
Right, but it can be irresponsible.
I think it's sensationalism, and I think it's a reverse kind of. I think it's a reverse kind of fear, right? That evangelicals or anyone who doesn't like Trump says, oh, he's Hitler, or he's a fascist. And I just don't think it's the best way of approaching getting the past to speak to the present. That's a historian's cop-out answer. Yeah.
I've asked you way too many. No, this is kind of for both. So when you're talking about faithful presence with people who may look, think, act differently, when we were with the CCCU, Senator Tim Scott was talking about how he does that by asking people across the aisle to go out to dinner with him. And that was his main way. He said he was carrying...
People who what? Go out to dinner with him?
Who are across the political aisle.
Oh, across
he would
the
just
aisle.
ask them to dinner. And he said that was the biggest political thing he did. So I think it was the same kind of argument, and I really appreciate that perspective that he gave then and you've given here. But what I haven't heard you address is, it seems to me, at least in the American context today, the biggest divide is urban-rural. And how does it look like for us to carry that out in this contemporary context? If you look at voting, or if you look at a lot of books like The Great Sort, or the way we've gotten into various clusters, This more recent thing, I think it was in the Atlantic, about the 9% that's all centered around Ivy League institutions, and the 91 that's kind of everywhere else. In a lot of ways, the urban-rural divide seems to be the biggest one, and yet we don't talk about it very much when we talk about connecting to those who don't think, act, look like we do. So I'm curious how that might play into your larger conversations.
Yeah, that's a great question, and I've read people talk about that. I mean, David Brooks is trying to address that. You think of what's the book by the J.D. Vance? Fascinating book. You should read it. It's interesting. Brother, I don't know that I have any wisdom for you. Genuinely, I could talk, but it wouldn't be worth anything.
I mean, I think you're right? We talked about this at dinner. I think you're right. I think there is a kind of, there is a kind of coastal kind of cultures that exist, whether you want to call them blue states or sort of more cosmopolitan. I live in a state that is often described as Pittsburgh and Philadelphia with Alabama in the middle, right? And I live in the middle of Alabama, right? Pennsylvania, but yeah. I'm not sure. I don't think I have much wisdom other than the fact that the same things that we've been talking about, right? I mean, take out a person who you disagree with, or take out a Joe. What, Joe, was that his name? Go over to Joe's house and have dinner with him. I'm on my back porch on a summer night, sitting there with a guy who's the janitor at the local school district, who is an 8th grade education, and we're enjoying. Can I say an adult beverage here at John Brown? Yeah, I mean we're so we're out there talking about sports or talking about the neighborhood or whatever. So I think the same principles kind of apply. And my wife and I actually made a deliberate choice to live in the neighborhood that we live in. We are the only college-educated people in our neighborhood. So I've learned a lot about, and we've talked about this with your neighbors too. So when the time comes to talk about weightier things, heavier things, right? Things about politics, things about Donald Trump. My whole neighborhood is suspect of me. He's the guy who doesn't like Trump. He wrote this book, right? Well, because I have cultivated relationships across, I live in a little cosmopolitan bubble in the middle of Pennsylvania, Alabama, Pennsylvania, right? But because I've tried to cultivate those relationships, and by no means am I a model for this, right? But when the time comes then to say, hey, I heard you wrote a book, right? I'm not embarrassed to kind of say, oh, great, now I have to have this conversation and get yelled at for. So I think it's all about sort of trying to build those relationships. But I think Brooks and others are right. I think those kinds of neighborhoods rarely exist. I mean, we tend to gather with our own, and I think it's that kind of polarization or that kind of clustering, I think was the word you used, that I think may ultimately get in the way of a healthy democratic society when it comes to political divisions.
And it may not sound like a great answer or an exciting answer, but I think relationships is spot on, whether we're talking about racial divides, demographic, economic divides, urban-rural divides. And there's sociological literature to back that up. Divided by Faith, for instance, talks about those evangelicals who have interracial relationships are profoundly impacted by their ability to understand various structural injustices, as opposed to those evangelicals who don't have cross-racial relationships. And I can just speak testimony on my own life, from moving from a childhood where everybody I knew was white to an adulthood that's not like that. And it's those personal relationships which have just impacted me, I would say, indelibly, right? And it just now take that same principle and apply it across different kinds of divides. And so if you take anything away is that we're going home with this, like, what do I do now? Build relationships with people who are different than you.
And that requires a certain degree of humility. Like in my neighborhood, I'm not the, I'm the weird college professor who doesn't know how to change the blade on his lawnmower, or who like needs help with putting shingles on my shed in my backyard, right? So I mean, in some ways, the world in which I live in, whatever credentials I have in the academic world or in some kind of cosmopolitan world don't really carry a lot of weight, right?
They might even work against you. Might even work against you socially.
Yeah. So I have to be humble and say, hey, I want my kid to learn how to, build a birdhouse. I'm going to send her over to you, to do this. And I think that's the way you build relationships. So when you do bring up the fact that, like, why are you voting for Donald Trump? What's he doing for you, right? You've built that trust. I think it's the same thing with as a kind of intellectual or an academic in a central Pennsylvania church that pretty much went 81% for Trump, an evangelical church. It's the same thing, right? We share a common faith, and thus people trust me when I also taught the class on Christianity and politics, although it was almost a year later. It wasn't right after so when I stand up there and start talking about the problems with I never bring up political figures, but when I talk about kind of an alternative way to think about politics, and this is why I stay within evangelicalism when many of my academic friends leave, because I want to be a kind of public witness there and build trust so that I can speak to my tribe about these issues and get them to perhaps think a little bit differently.
I'm going to draw out one principle that he articulated. Biblical hospitality and faithful presence isn't imperialistic. That is to say, I'm going across a boundary because I have something to give and to teach. Rather, biblical hospitality, and I think a Christian's posture of blessed are the poor in spirit, often goes across boundaries to also say, there are things I have to learn. I have some things that I want to say, but you know what? I also have a lot to learn. And so you're going into the working class neighborhood, and you're not acting as if I have the answers here. I'm the college professor.
This is something I learned the hard way early in my career, right? Where young PhD, I got the world solved, right? And next thing you know, I'm alienating the entire room because I'm being a pompous jerk, right? Learning to listen, and that you build these kinds of habits after kind of doing it for 15, 20 years. So. Yeah.
So I have a follow-up question for both of you. It seems that you both really care and emphasize the role of relationships and faithful presence. Neither of you have talked much about social media. This thing that was created to help cultivate good, healthy relationships in community, which ironically seems to have torn people apart. Can you talk about social media and its role in the sorts of relationships that you think are important? Do we need to ditch social media? What role does social media play in all of this?
It's a double-edged sword. Some of you know I see kind of blogging, social media as very intricate to my calling and vocation as what I do as a historian who wants to reach the public. My idea is to kind of redeem, not in a theological way as much, but kind of bring good history, right, to Twitter and to social media and so forth. I think that's a wonderful outlet for doing that. On the other hand, it's also the source of a lot of our problems. Forget about Trump and his tweets. I mean, we tend to write. You all know the narrative now. It's a pretty established narrative, right? We tend to follow, and we get our news from our feeds where it's just, people who believe just like us. I think Nicholas Kristof, the New York Times columnist, called it the Daily Me, right? We get what's, and we never kind of interact with other positions. And I think the engagement with people who we differ is what makes a healthy democracy. So I have great fear. No fear, I shouldn't say that, right? I worry about, and I'm a failed Christian for having that fear, right? I'm a bad Christian, but I think if you're worried about the health of the democracy, I think it can work the other way too. Having said that, there are people in this room who are part of the community that I have created online that are actually physically here today because of that community. So, you make those, hopefully it's always working. For me, at least, it's always working towards the human connections. That's why when my publisher said, why don't you do a social media blog book tour, right? Instead of actually physically going to places where you'd have to stay in hotels and, and I said, no, I want to talk to people. I want to create, so I find at a lot of my book talks, we did 12 independent bookstores over the summer, and now we're on college campuses. I find these kinds of, a lot of healing going on, people talking to one another saying like, I'm so glad I came. I couldn't have this conversation in my church even because it's about politics and religion, and it's not necessarily me, but it's people talking to one another that, so I think it's a double-edged sword. I think social media can serve positive ends.
I was looking through your Twitter feed.
Uh-oh.
It's mostly retweets and you pointing to like different sources.
Yeah, I think that's what I do. I try to give alternative, good history, right? Good theology, good historical theology, whatever, and that's what I kind of use. Now, you catch me at like 11:30 at night, where I'm half asleep and I'm ticked off about something.
Turn off Twitter.
Yeah, stay off Twitter.
Turn it off.
Don't
do it.
But I think
Walk
I think there's a sense in which too with threads on Twitter you can unpack things, historical arguments. There's been several historians, especially, who've been very good at this, in making arguments about this. So yeah.
I would say a couple things. Yeah, double-edged sword. That is to say, you can be used for good and used for bad, right? I would say if you're on Twitter or Facebook, number one, always be mindful of your evangelism. Is what you post going to make evangelism easier or harder for you because of the witness and the example you're setting, right? Are you representing Christ? Number two, I would encourage you just to avoid snarkiness. It just doesn't accomplish anything. It accomplishes some things. It attracts followers. You can attract followers who already agree with you, basically, right? But instead, I would use your Twitter feed and I would use your Facebook post to look for ways to point to good resources, as he was saying. You can't really have meaningful theological, political conversations. So you don't need to patrol and tell everybody who you disagree with that you disagree with it. You're honestly, you're not accomplishing anything substantive or meaningful there, at least 99% of the time. Instead, I would say look for ways to build up or point to good resources. Yeah, I think just it's really easy to compromise our witness, and I'd encourage you not to do that. And I would say be mindful of your fellow church members. If you're going to be sharing the Lord's table with them on Sunday, tweet, Facebook, as if you were there at that meal, right, with them. And hopefully that'll moderate some of what you might be impelled to say otherwise.
Great advice, thanks. I think we have time for maybe one more question.
You mentioned ultimate evangelical goal of sharing the gospel. Try to think of this as like a general question, but it doesn't really work when you try to generalize sharing the gospel. So my question for the both of you would be...
Well, I said be mindful of it. Be mindful of sharing the gospel.
Right. But, sorry. Leading into that, I would say, as individuals, both of you, what is the gospel? How do you share it? And how does your definition of the gospel impact the way you share it?
Yeah, great question. I mean, I could do it in 4 words. God, man, Christ response, right? God created us good. We have decided to be God, and so we have sinned against him. We have broken his law. God in his goodness had a plan to save and use and glorify a people for the celebration of his own glory. So he sent his son, fully God, fully man, to live the life that we should have lived but didn't, and to die the death that we deserve for all those who would repent and believe and turn and rose again. He bore the penalty for sinners and rose again from the grave so that all who would repent and believe would be united to him, and by that same act be united to one another as his people, as the church. And he is coming again to restore all things to himself. Now, the Bible uses lots of metaphors, right? For the Bible, we could talk about adoption, we could talk about reconciliation, we could talk about freedom. And I think in any given conversation, I might lean into this metaphor a little bit more, lean into that metaphor a little bit more in how I'm sharing the gospel. I think what's hard to do, it's easy to talk about the good bits of the gospel. It's hard to talk about sin, judgment, right? Wrath, repentance. You talk that way, people don't like it. And the temptations for Christians is to kind of pull away from those things and kind of put the good things out front. And I think we need, and that's a temptation for me when I'm sharing the gospel. And that's just fear of man instead of fear of God. And I'm not saying you need to say the whole gospel and every time you're sitting down with somebody to talk some. I might just, maybe I'm talking to an addict or something like that, or somebody struggling with a porn addiction. I might talk about, it's for freedom Christ has set us free, and emphasize those elements. Nonetheless, say in that conversation with the person struggling with a porn addiction or something like that, I'm also going to talk about, look, that sin of looking at porn. On the one hand, you're sinning against the women who you're looking at, or the men and the women that you're looking at. You're contributing to all sorts of social evils, but even more than that, you're sinning against God, the one in whose image you're made, right? And there are consequences for that sin. But oh my gosh, the gospel's so good. You want this more than you want the porn. I promise. And Christ offers a better way. So I want to talk about sin and judgment, but I also want to talk about the goodness of Christ.
I can't add to anything to that other than, first of all, I'm really bad at sharing the gospel with people. I'm in the kind of, sitting next to the person on the airplane kind of thing. Christ has died, Christ has risen, Christ is coming again. That is the good news. And this is at the heart of what it means to be an evangelical. So, I remember sitting at Georgetown University talking to at a conference on secularism, of all things. Secularism, not secular humanism, but the idea of secularism, right? This separation of church and state. And I was giving a talk on the founders, and the guy says to me, the Georgetown professor who is an atheist says to me, I like you, Thea. You're an evangelical, but you're not in my face. Like, you're not trying to preach to me. So I said back, well, the fact that's an oxymoron, right? The fact that I'm an evangelical means I don't want the state to preach to you, but let's go have coffee after this, and I'd like to share with you the hope that lies within me, right? And the whole place laughed because they knew this guy. It was like, could you imagine me as an evangelical Christian or born again Christian? But so for me, there is the kind of moments that, divine appointments or whatever, when people come but for me, I tend to often think of evangelism as a scholar and an academic. My mission field is often the academic world and the people that I engage with, and there it's a very, very it's the long game, right? So, to me, I want to steal back the word evangelical from the pundits and the politicians who have turned it into something that is, about power and about nostalgia and about, fear and so forth. And I want to be a witness for that gospel. with the people who are not easily going to be convinced by the four spiritual laws or the Roman road or the D. James Kennedy model or whatever. It's much more of I find it's much more. Back in the day, we used to call this lifestyle evangelism. When I took John Nyquist for evangelism at Trinity Evangelical Divinity School, that's what we called it. But it's being faithfully present and saying, finally saying, and I've had secular scholars say, like, what, you're different, or what is, why are you, what is it that the hope that lies within you, kind of thing. So there's in the academic world, which is deeply secular, there is this kind of long game that needs to be played, and that's so that's how I think about my vocation and calling. And I will say one more thing, and this sort of comes back to my book about Trump, is, you said, Jonathan, think about evangelism, right? I said this today to a group, and I'll say it again, because when you align yourself with someone like Donald Trump, there's all kinds of reasons why you're doing it, right? All kinds of culture war reasons or so forth. And we are taking victory laps, the church at least. We got the right Supreme Court justices. The federal judiciary has been changed for the next generation, 2 generations, right? We got our guys in the Supreme Court. The question no one is asking is, what does the public witness of the gospel and the church look like because we have aligned ourselves with Trump? What does that look like in 30 or 40 years? I don't hear a lot of people asking that question. And, I've said this a couple times today already in various settings, but I think this is, if we're concerned about evangelism, we need to think about that. Sometimes that may be even more important than the kind of culture war battles that we win. If siding with an adulterer, a xenophobe, a misogynist, whatever you want to call him, is going to hurt our witness, that's a problem, I think, for the church. So my audience in my book is largely the church, and I do have evangelism in mind as I think about the way we present ourselves publicly in the world.
It's such a good question, brother. Thank you. And I think increasingly you also you want to see your evangelism in the context of the witness of the church. And John is concerned about the witness of the church, capital C, as it were, right? Place of Christianity in America. And I think we also want to be concerned about the witness of our local churches and cultivating cultures of evangelism. And I think the life together of our congregations is a crucial part of our evangelism. And I could tell you stories. I think of Ryan, for instance. Ryan, he had grown up in Texas, where the witness of many Christians and many churches was hypocrisy, right? Where the people he partied with on Friday and Saturday night would show up in church on Sunday. And he's like, why would I do what you're doing? Because we're having fun now, and I just don't lie about it like you do, right? So the churches were anti-evangelism in that sense, anti-gospel in their witness. But then he came to Washington, D.C., and his mom got saved through the ministry of our church, and he watched the church embrace her, and he watched the church, the members of the church love one another, and he was invited to barbecues, and they loved him, and they loved each other, and he watched how they cared for his mother through a crisis in her life, and suddenly that church became a backdrop to the evangelistic enterprises and to Ryan's life, right? So there was people sharing the gospel with Ryan, and the backdrop was this lovely, beautiful life of people living together, not perfectly, but in righteousness and peace and love. And that was what compelled Ryan to ultimately repent and believe himself. So we can't think of evangelistic just in individualistic terms. No, we need to think about it in cultural, communal terms within our congregations. So thank you for that great question.
Well, you have both given us a lot to think about. It's been a great conversation. Thank you for helping us to push the restart button. Thank you for giving us hope and helping us to reimagine our faith in public life. We really appreciate you being here. Let's thank our guests.